Why was the Normandy landing carried out right there? Because the beaches there had the ideal characteristics for launching an assault. If the Allies had chosen a random beach, the outcome would probably have been disastrous. Today, as you might have guessed, I want to tell you about the Normandy landing, which is one of the most well-known chapters of World War II and has inspired countless films, such as Saving Private Ryan. The truly incredible thing about this story is that some crucial decisions for the success of the operation were made by geologists. In other words, without the geologists, history would have turned out differently. But we'll get to that in a moment. Before diving into the details, it's a good idea to give a brief military overview, so we can understand the reasons behind this landing and, above all, who the parties involved were. The year is 1943. We are in the midst of World War II, and in order to defeat the Nazis, it was necessary to open a front in the West. To do that, it would be necessary to land in northern France. This operation was codenamed Overlord, and it would take place the following year, in 1944, under the command of Dwight Eisenhower. But where to land? The most logical choice would have been near Calais, since it was one of the points in France closest to the United Kingdom. However, this was exactly what the Germans expected, so much so that the coastal defenses there were at their highest level. In fact, in the previous months, the Nazis had built a long system of fortifications, bunkers, artillery, and minefields along the northern coasts of continental Europe, which became known as the Atlantic Wall, and around Calais, it was especially strong. In short, it was necessary to find an alternative landing point, and this is where the geologists come into play. The choice of the landing site was not random. In fact, we might not think about it, but the grain size of the sand, that is, the size of the grains, could have had a huge impact on the success of the operation. For example, if the landing had taken place on a fine-grained beach, the heavy equipment and soldiers could have gotten stuck, making them easy targets for German artillery. On the other hand, coarse, pebbly sand could have limited the maneuverability of the amphibious vehicles needed to get past the shoreline defenses. In short, they needed to find a beach with just the right characteristics. And who could do that better than geologists? The first phase involved studying aerial photographs to figure out which spots might be the best for landing. But as useful as this information was, it still wasn't enough to make such an important decision. So that's exactly where phase 2 comes in, carefully collecting beach samples. But how do you effectively collect soil samples in enemy territory? Well, in '44, some British divers risked their lives by approaching the coast without being seen and collecting numerous samples from the most likely sites, so they could figure out which shores were suitable for amphibious vehicles to land and, based on that, decide how to modify equipment and vehicles to invade the German coastal fortifications. At this point, after obtaining the samples, they moved on to phase 3, the creation of top-secret geological maps. Clearly, these were based on aerial photos and the samples that had been collected. In the end, after all the work, an 80-kilometer stretch of coastline in Normandy was selected, much further west than Calais, whose sand had the optimal characteristics to support a large-scale landing. Besides, the Atlantic Wall here was weaker than the one at Calais. Specifically, 5 stretches of coastline were identified, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The first 2 beaches were reserved for the American landings, while the other 3 were assigned to British and Canadian troops. At this point, Operation Overlord was ready to begin. Before the landing, a massive campaign of aerial bombardment was planned, and on the night before the operations, June 5, 1944, about 20,000 paratroopers and airborne soldiers were dropped to seize strategic points such as bridges and railway junctions. The Allies also organized a large-scale deception operation to make the Germans believe that the landing would take place at Calais. They could also count on the support of the French resistance, which carried out numerous sabotage operations against the Germans before the landing. At dawn on June 6th, the actual landing began. The warships that had approached the coast shelled the German defenses. Afterwards, the landing craft moved closer to the beaches and disembarked the soldiers under fire from the Germans, who were shooting from their positions. The Anglo-Americans, however, who had a clear superiority in equipment and manpower, managed to successfully complete the operations. On Omaha Beach, however, German resistance proved stronger than expected, and the Americans were only able to capture the beach at the cost of heavy losses. The Germans did not deploy all their resources to counter the landing, even after the operations had begun. In fact, they continued to believe that the real invasion would take place at Calais and that the Normandy landing was just a diversion. All in all, about 156,000 soldiers landed on the French coast on D-Day. The Allies lost about 10,000 men, including over 4,000 killed. The Germans, on the other hand, suffered losses estimated between 4,000 and 9,000 men, including dead, wounded, and prisoners. The entire Operation Overlord, including the soldiers who arrived in the following days, involved about 850,000 people along with a large number of planes, tanks, and other vehicles. This piece of history was of central importance for the outcome of the Second World War. The landing, in fact, marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. The Germans, in fact, continued to put up fierce resistance in the following months, but they could not stop the Allied advance. On August 26th, the Free French troops, that is, the French soldiers who had not accepted defeat in 40 and were fighting against the Germans under General de Gaulle, liberated Paris. In April of the following year, the Allies advancing from the west and the Russians coming from the east met near the Elbe River. The war in Europe was therefore over, and Nazism had been defeated. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and that it helped you discover a side of the Normandy landings that often doesn't get told. Among other things, geologists were essential not only for characterizing the beaches, but also for identifying, for example, areas where the ground would allow for the construction of airstrips for military aircraft. So, this role of the geologist, often underestimated, was of primary importance for the success of the operation. If you have any other questions or curiosities about this, let me know in the comments. And if you want more videos explaining other important military operations, just let me know. We'll see each other again in the next video, right here on Geopop.